Hi, everybody. This is our first online open evening, so I hope it goes as smoothly as our in-person ones do. I'm Will Hunter. I'm the founder of the school and currently its chief executive. And I'm going to give you a quick talk about the London School of Architecture and what we're about, with the hope that you, as great individuals and students, will come to join us for part 2 next year. Okay, so we're a new school for a new century. We were founded in 2015, so we're recruiting our 6th cohort at the moment. We're seeking students with independent minds rather than independent means. And by that we mean that we want people to be able to think creatively, but we also don't want to just attract the richest students, but we want to make sure that we attract people from across the whole of society. We use the city as the campus. So we base all our projects in London, but we also use latent spaces in the city to teach. We unite academia and practice. So our students are placed in a work placement in their first year. We have 120 practices in our practice network, and we're validated by London Metropolitan University. So we very much see ourselves as a professional network model of education, and the practice network is core to that, surrounded by the profession and then the public. Our vision is to educate students from across the whole of society to improve the ways that humanity lives in cities and on the planet. We've designed a theory of change that seeks to develop the stages for us to achieve this. So the inputs are students, practice network, faculty, founders and physical resources. We have enablers, London Met validation, professional body recognition, and office for students. Our activities are the first year, the second year in the public programme. And our outcomes are graduates and design research that then go on to the architectural profession or an adjacent discipline to improve the way that we live in cities and on the planet. So we have 5 values, prime values. First, to be propositional, that don't just critique but make a proposal. Relevant, that you have to ask the right question rather than the wrong question. Innovative, that we want the world to change for the better. Metropolitan, that we're engaged in the kind of big mess and vibrancy of the city. And entrepreneurial, that we're always seeking new ways of doing things and ways that we can add value. So what we've achieved so far, we've had over 1,000 applications, 190 students enrolled, $750,000 funds raised, full recognition for the ARB, the RBA, the QAA, the OFS, everybody we've applied to, and 30% student growth in 2019. Students choose us. I mean, this is what people write on their application forms, so you have to take it with a slight pinch of salt. But this is what people say. As far as revolutionary new models for education go, I believe the LSA has set the bar for the UK and Europe. One of the most dynamic, exciting and inspiring architectural environments in the world. So you should believe these students who've come before you. Graduate feedback. I've learned an incredible amount about the city. I feel that I have been given the tools to not just be an architect, but a city shaper and a change maker. Graduate feedback. The LSA has given us each the confidence to pursue our own interests and make desires to make cities better. Paul Finch, who's the founder of the World Architecture Festival, sees the LSA as the most innovative school since the unit system of the Architectural Association, and he says that it shows that innovation can happen in education. Sam Gyimah, who you may remember was Education Secretary for about 3 minutes while he was still a Tory, and before he made a disastrous idea to join that party that kept changing its name and was ultimately kicked out of Parliament. He said it's very encouraging to see new, smaller specialist providers such as the LSA driving innovation and diversifying opportunities. We've achieved pretty much 100% employment since we opened. So it might be about 98%, but it's incredibly high, the amount of employment for our graduates because of the way that we've integrated with the practice network. We work with lots of people on our press. We've had a lot of attention for being innovative. We've worked with a range of partners to deliver our programme. And why do we do it? So the UK context, architecture, there's about 100,000 architecture jobs in the UK, and the London architecture sector is worth 1.7 billion. So we're currently focused on London. We thought that the rise in tuition fees potentially created a huge obstacle for people entering the profession. And this ratio of debt to income is a real problem for architecture students across their 30-year career. 75% of architecture students come from affluent backgrounds. That's pretty scandalous. 95% of architecture courses at uni charge the maximum 18,500 and don't offer any give back with a practice placement. So the Farrell Review said that we need to address this kind of disparity between earnings and between tuition fees, and that we need a new range of courses to be offered. So we didn't just want to be like a university, a big ivory tower and something off-putting for people. We wanted to be able to be adaptable and change to the way that the world changes. When the world changes, we change with it. These are all the universities that offer an architecture program in the UK. It's only really the AA and the Centre for Alternative Technology and the LSA that are more independent providers. We didn't want to be this architecture school crushed by a big university, so we've always sought to be independent and outward facing. We've had a slight critique of architecture schools that produce work that is disengaged from the reality of how architecture might make a real impact in the world. And we've not wanted to be an architecture school that produces these object buildings that at the most derisory are seen as not only not integrating into the built environment, but positively attacking all the things that are around it. So we're very much from Malcolm Gladwell that the 20th century was about the lone geniuses, whereas the 21st century is about smart people working together. And we definitely see you as those smart people who would be working together with us. Daniel Susskind, who's a political thinker, used to work in Number 10, says the challenge for architects is to anticipate the new tasks that require their unique talents and to develop the skills that will therefore be required in years to come. As more and more jobs are automated, says Alistair Parvin, the last thing of all to be automated will be that particular skill of the designer to synthesize complex, soft, contextual problems. So cities is a main focus for us. Half of humanity now live in them, 3% of the Earth's surface, but 75% of our carbon emissions. As cities grow, they grow super exponentially. So that means that their resource demands will become infinite in a finite time span. Geoffrey West, a mathematician, has modelled that we will need to have world-changing innovations more and more quickly to mitigate the effects of that rise in needs for resources. So we're looking at a school at all the different levels that architecture can impact on, from the micro level up to the policy level. We're also using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as our framework, which are trying to make a framework for how the world could change by 2030 so that we could live on the planet sustainably. Many of our projects, if not all of them, try and tackle at least one of the UN SDGs and look about where they could improve that through design. Peter Buchanan, who's our lecturer on urbanism and humanity and the planet, says that architecture is the nexus where all disciplines and fields of knowledge converge, as fundamental as language. And I think that's a real motivator for the course, to think about the real power and purpose of architecture that underpins everything we try and do at school. He also says that at this point of epochal change, where all the epochs are ending at once, and what comes next? We don't know, but that's for you to decide. You will be the generation that decides that vision. So it's really important that you're empowered and articulate to do it. He says we're moving to this series of paradigm shifts. It's an emerging world, from separation to connection, all the way through to planet as resource to planet as partner. These are big shifts that you could be at the forefront of. We're looking at the theory of cultural evolution and how the world is changing and how architecture then must change with it. And it's not about the world of design, but the design of the world, as Bruce Mau put it. I think that's as best as I couldn't put it any better. I think it's a great quote, and that's what we're really looking at. So how do we do it? This is the first drawing I made for the architecture school in 2011. Well, it was my New Year's resolution for 2011. I made it in 2010. So it's been a 10-year project. And the first image of it was called Arthur, Alternative Routes for Architecture. And it was people sat around a table and they were talking and figuring out what to do. And that's been a key metaphor and methodology for the school, is people sat around a table working together to make something happen. We've always wanted to be not a traditional hierarchy, but a network. And being a network is in, there's a centre and a periphery rather than a top and a bottom, that it's about relationships. I wrote an article in the Architectural Review called Alternative Routes for Architecture that sought for people to get in touch with me so that we could start making a school. And that's how we built the coalition to start the London School of Architecture. We ended up on the rooftop of a building in London for the Evening Standard as we launched our new programme. And this was the first drawing I did that I took round on a sheet of A3 to all the practices and said, hey, here's my vision for a school. It's got a brain at the centre of it, which is the first year and the second year. The London School of Architecture, you might be able to zoom in and see, is a dotted line, not a hard line, to show that it's porous and that things can move in and out. All those little keywords in the moat of blue are the keywords from the EU directive on architectural education, maybe slightly less relevant now, we shall see. But that's what we're looking at to touch upon. And in the pink miasma around it, all the sort of knowledge bases, or many of the knowledge bases that are producing new thinking that architecture could have a spatial impact on and really help realise those new bits of knowledge. Underpinning that is a kind of dartboard of every borough in London that says, this is the area that we're looking at. And like Richard Sennett says, it's not about being multidisciplinary, but it's about using the city as a place that unites complex forms of knowledge. So we took the binary model of education, academia, practice, and we've made it a slice. So they're graded together. So you start in first year with more practice and second year with more academia. That means when you get into it in a granular way, that you can work 3 days a week for 12 months, and you could work over the summer for 12 weeks, and then one or 2 days a week in second year for those first 2 terms. That means that you can earn baseline 12 grand, but if you do everything, up to 20 grand, which would be a huge contribution to your course costs. So we're really hoping that that relationship with practice is a fruitful and profitable one to support your studies. Who's involved in the school? You're going to meet many of them later, I hope, in this new online format. These were our founding students, the pioneers. They got a lot of attention like our firstborn, but we see every year as the first year. The school is created afresh every year by the people in it. So it's really important that you come along and see, how would you make a school? You know, that's really important. What is your ideal school, and what would stop you from making that happen with us? We're really trying to reach the full potential of you and of the institution, and we need to do that together and in partnership. Our founding directors are Deborah Saunt, Clive, Sall and James Soane. Founding leaders, Tom Holbrook, Alan Powers and Lewis Kinneir. And we have a board of trustees, Simon Alford from AHMM and Deborah Saunt from DSDHA are our 2 architectural ones. Crispin Kelly, who's the chair, who's a developer from Baylight. We have a series of founding patrons who've given us money, who've made this happen, and we're incredibly grateful that they've bought into this idea and seen it as a profitable way for them to invest their charitable donations. And we have, like I was saying, 120 practices that include 20,000 employees around the globe. So that's a very powerful network of people that you could be interacting with. The practice network has a very wide range of people involved with it, from kind of Cullinan Studio, Reba Gold Medal winner, Hal Tompkins Sterling Prize winner, Commodity Grauck, Charlotte Skene Catling, Will Alsop, the late great Will Alsop, my mentor, the only place I've ever worked, Roger Zagolovich, Assemble Turner Prize winners. So a real broad range of people who you could be interacting with. Where do we do it? So we really do the city as campus. This is showing all the practice placements from last year, spread across London. We were based at Second Home to begin with. We had a little desk there. We're now on Mare Street in Hackney, which is our shop front and our studio base for next year. We may move the year beyond because we like to be itinerant, but that's where we will definitely be for next year. A studio space for about 50 students. This is our students excitedly ripping off the front of our building. And it was designed to be a very flexible space. So it can work for lectures, seminars, exhibitions, anything you want. Here it is for the end of year summer exhibition. But we really do teach around of London. So this is doing orientation event in a practice, working at the weekends at Roger Stirk Harbour, Allies and Morrison, Tony Vidler giving a drawing workshop, crits and reviews at Somerset House, a symposium at Minotti. We've certainly found that having a symposium on soft sofas created a better environment than having everyone sat in a row and using a microphone. People found that balance of power was not very likeable. But we also do public lectures at the Royal Academy, even in rooms above pubs in Hackney. We have building visits. This is going around to look at the new Bloomberg building with Foster and Partners. We do dinner parties at High Table in practice network apartments, another dinner at Minotti, a gallery. So we use Somerset House, Rocker, John McCaslan, graduation lunch at Bistro Tech in Hackney. So you can see that anything that might happen in a school can happen all around the city in a very nomadic way. So this was a diagram drawn by some of our students in the first year, showing that all of the tools that they use to make LSA life possible weren't around 10 years before. And I think that's really important, that you can see that this is a very new school and operating in a new way, that it couldn't happen 10 years ago, but that you would be, even as an institutional aim, and the way you operate, very much at the vanguard of practice. And certainly now that we are all living in lockdown and working remotely, I think we can really see how the school has very quickly been able to adapt to that. And I'm quite proud of that, actually, that we've been able to do that so quickly and seeing the opportunity in it. So what do? We ask you 3 questions. What change do you want to see in the world? How does your architecture contribute to that change? And who do you want to be as a designer? And we ask those questions at the orientation, and we ask them all throughout the school and try and get you to answer them over those 2 years. We start with an inter-practice year, 3 days a week in practice, 2 days a week with us. Proto-practice year where you're in the LSA studio working on projects. We have 10 modules, but they all interrelate. You start with critical practice that runs all the way through first year. You do design cities, then a design think tank, then design direction that leads into design speculation in second year, design history that relates to how you speculate in the studio, and then a comprehensive design project that pulls all that learning together into an absolutely brilliant vision of what you might do in your future life. You produce 3 publications, the design think tank publication, a manifesto for the practice you might like to be in future, and a critical practice manual on the practice you're currently in. How does that operate? Your portfolio takes the other 7 modules and does a continuous design portfolio. We assess your work in 3 ways. Intentionality, what is it you want to do? How relevant is it? How ambitious is it? Synthesis, is your vision pulled together? Could it work? And the impact, what change would this make in the city? We look at you in a team and figure out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and how could you work in a team? And how do you get to know other people, and how that then informs how you get to know yourself. The design think tank, which is what I lead, is led by a pair of practitioners, groups to 6 to 7 students, and you produce a collaborative design process that comes with a group output. This year we looked at 8 topics, which you'll be able to read about very shortly in our new magazine. This was the think tank that I led in the first year, called EDGY, Ethical Dwellings for Generation Y. And it looked at the challenge of creating housing for millennials in a city. We looked at a new development model. We then looked at the habits, customs, and rituals of how people live. This then made a holocaust of sharing that then informed a spatial armature that then made an urban block which had different moments of privacy and public life in it. We're very much a school that asks why and how. And if I could only say 2 words to you and ask 2 questions throughout your whole education, it would be why and how. Why do you want to do something? And ask it over and over again to get to your top motivation and how you're going to do it, to get down and down and down to the detail about how you're going to deliver it. Those two things work in parallel and are very powerful for you to understand what you're doing and then how it gets delivered. As a school, we're a startup, and we've tried to make the school in a way that also impacts the way that we teach. So we looked at a certain problem that felt overfacing. Then we set a desired outcome, and the problem immediately became smaller. Then we did a projected backstory and thought about the next little step. So launching our part 2 was that first step. And then we will be adding further ones till we get to the full desired outcome. This is a way of thinking that we also use throughout the design think tanks and other projects, that all of your work should be addressing a challenge or opportunity and thinking about what step can you make next. We look about incremental innovation versus disruptive innovation. Incremental being a little step forward, disruptive being a game changer. As an example, Farshid Musavi, who's in our academic court, looked at balconies and then twisted them to make them so they didn't overlook. Game changer Richard Rogers, who took all the core from the centre of the building and stuck it on the outside, and that's a career, game-changing move. Disruptive innovation, the best and maybe the only real direct measure of innovation is changing human behaviour. So I think it's really important to know that as a school, we put human behaviour and people and users at the heart of everything we do. Here are our beautiful first cohort. 2 of them, just to give you an example, formed a practice called Studio Eightfold, straight out of the LSA, or even during the second year. They then went and worked at Will Alsop's, borrowed a bit of space from him to form their office, and incubated there. They used our network of people to discuss the projects. They then ended up through connections through the LSA with a 40-unit housing developer in Berlin. This is how they got their work. London School of Architecture, Red Deer was their tutor at the LSA. So sort of over 50% of work coming through the school. And that this is the kind of zone of stuff that they're looking at, quite a broad range of stuff. So they've taken their thesis project and used that to launch a campaign in the Evening Standard that then became an exhibition in London Design Week, and then was at Sall Biennale alongside some major architects, shown as an international biennale as work that was relevant. So quite an amazing trajectory from graduating in 2017. Our future, what do we want to do? So we're moving from startup to scale up. That's the next big leap, and that's the game-changing leap. So we want to be adding new stuff. Everything that we do should be leading towards our vision. So the Part 2 diploma in the circle we currently have, the next things that we're adding around it, the squares, will be coming online from 2021. Our primary objective is to expand our ability to widen access and design sustainable architecture in cities. We have assets that we're trying to leverage for our future, and also to pick up on industry trends to make sure we're at the forefront of those and also help shape them as they emerge. Our strategy is to develop the architecture program and the practice network to lead towards a university for cities, what we're calling unicity or unicity, which means wholeness and uniqueness. We very much see our future as unicity or university for cities as a 10-year goal for where we want to be and the impact that we want to have. We're spending a lot of money from next year in widening access. We're launching something called collective peer development that reinvents CPD as something that's about sharing expertise rather than just product manufacturers telling you about their products. We've launched a new magazine called Citizen, which shows all the work at the school, and I hope you're really, really excited about it. And we're very much a network institution, as I said. So we're moving from Sarnoff's law to Metcalfe's law to Reed's law, and Reed's law says that clusters of nodes in the network become really powerful. That's definitely what we're trying to achieve. We've then started redrawing the school not as this hierarchy, but as a heterarchy and as a network of relationships. That led to realizing certain constraints of that and wanting to move up the table to become a teal organization, which means we're a living organism, which is like not a heterarchy, but a holarchy. So we want to innovate, not just in the program, but in how the institution's organized, so that as we scale, innovation is embedded at every level. And that we really become an institution that isn't top down, but innovates at every level. And just a final slide for the part one. We're using this idea of integrated learning to form the part one. And the idea is that it will move from private life to public life to integrated life to emerging life over those 2 years. And that students would then have a thorough grounding in being able to design that emerging life. And that would lead into the part two. So that's starting from 2021, we hope. The school, we hope, will get bigger. And we really hope that you guys listening have been inspired by this and that you want to be a part of our future and that you will be applying. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's James Soane. I'm the Director of Critical Practice at the LSA, and I also run my own practice, Project Orange. And I'm here to talk to you about 2 modules that come under the banner of critical practice. So when we talk about critical practice, really what we're talking about is the ability to think and theorize and triangulate between the world of ideas and the world of practice. Now, here's a building you may or may not know, but you can probably recognize it's by Zaha Hadid Architects. It's in Hong Kong, and certainly it's one of those icon buildings. But I went to visit not that long ago, and this is what I found. And I think it represents everything that is in crisis with architecture today, namely that it's designed by machine and handmade, and this is what you get, a kind of horrible car crash of a detail. This is right in the entrance. And so we need to rethink our relationship between the built object and our understanding of the purpose of architecture. As Corbusier said in 1923 when he wrote his Vers une architecture, eyes which do not see. And certainly today we can be sure there are many eyes looking the other way when it comes to big questions. And of course one of those, possibly the biggest, is the climate emergency, and the UK joined many other architects across the globe declaring this climate and biodiversity emergency, which is really one of the frameworks through which we understand the purpose and the nature of architectural research and practice today. And so in both 2018 and 2019, the Global Economic Forum identified weather extremes, natural disasters, the failure of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and water crisis as the highest and most probable for global risks for humanity. But clearly they didn't think about COVID-19. But all of these things are somehow interlinked, and it's important to understand what we can do as architects in order to mitigate and deal with these issues. Last year, these are just snaps from my phone, but on the same day, the White House was undercutting evidence of climate crisis while Ethiopia was planting 350 million trees. These are actually questions about ideology and about political power. But climate change is not just a pollution issue. It's an indicator of how human psyche and culture have become divorced from our natural habitat. This could be understood as the end point of modernism, even. So at the LSA, with 3 Ps, planet. How do we look at things at the scale of a planet and understand cause and effect? Politics. You can't think about architecture and our agency without understanding the political will and the levers of power. And people. We design buildings for people, not for other architects. And even this slide, looking at the picture behind, or the towers behind, and you see a real juxtaposition in this community project, which is definitely all about people interacting, mingling, making, doing, to these little shoe boxes stacked up. And it asks us to reflect, where did we go wrong, really, in terms of our models for living. The other thing we do, you can't see this properly, but academia with practice. We try to merge the questions that are asked within schools of architecture, universities and academic establishments with the real questions that drive practice, and look at those connections and interrelationships, which often are in denial, certainly when you're in a school of architecture. How often do you really talk about the practice of architecture? And similarly, within practice, how much do you really care about what's happening in student portfolios? We believe that creating a tension and a friction between these two things will enable you to understand how to operate in the world better. So here are some of the themes that we will look at, but if we just pick three of them out: feminism, equality, and practice. Here is a 1930s architect's office, and you wouldn't really know, it could be a solicitor's and it's all men in their suits and hats. By the 1960s it's got sexier, and here we have a kind of bit of a Vogue model lying on another model, and here more recently a James Bond lookalike, but they're all men. And so we recognise there is an issue of gender in architecture. So of course women in practice is an important movement, but even that only encapsulates part of the question of who's in power in architecture, who calls the shots. And this is an example just to show you how relevant it is. The RIBA recent exhibition, The Brits That Built the Modern World, and this is the official photograph that was taken to commemorate that event, and this was the photograph syndicated. Can you spot the difference? It's not great, is it? And so myself and three other colleagues actually decided to take on this and wrote a book called A Gendered Profession, Question of Representation in Space Making. But moving to the structure of the course. The structure is important, and as it stands at the moment, we still have a physical model where you will work in practice and you have a practice mentor, which goes into your critical practice manual. They will help you. We have a practice leaders who work with think tank projects, which are also in first year. And then in the second year, you have design tutors that come from practice and work with you on your thesis project. This may change, and we are an agile school, and we are certainly looking at what's going to happen in the 2020-21. But nonetheless, the questions don't go away. In fact, they become more important. So here is an example of one of the students a few years ago sitting in his practice and sharing with them some of the work that he's been doing about the practice. So it becomes a conversation where there's a two-way dialogue, and the student is both part of the practice and part of the LSA, and it gives you a unique standpoint. And these are some of the big things that we will ask you to think about when you have your practice hat on. What motivates your practice? What are the challenges to the 21st century architect? What's your position on the ethics of practice? An attitude to technology and technical challenges? Climate change action. Do you do anything? How is finance discussed? What is the culture of the practice? The relationship with the building industry? The value of end users and performance metrics? And finally, client relationships. These are all things that we should be discussing both in practice and in schools. And you will write a manual. Do what it says on the tin. It's a manual. It's how we do things. And here are some examples from last year, which I'll just run through. They're all different. Clearly, they're different practices, but the idea is that each student decides to take a lens and look through that lens at the practice and try and understand the DNA. And moving into critical practice theory, we'll ask you to do quite a lot of reading. You get 15 lectures, 3 book clubs, and 2 one-to-one tutorials, so there's a lot of input. But importantly, it's about reading and understanding the world as it is today. So many of the books and the texts will be very current, because we feel that the currency of today's world is really important to engage with. And 2 of the themes we'll talk about are intertwining and deep adaptation. Deep adaptation talks about the resilience and the relinquishment, restoration and reconciliation in order to arrive at radical hope. And that's something that is definitely part of how the LSA sees itself. But there are political dimension as well. Extinction Rebellion around the globe. People have been rebelling for life. They've been asking governments to put in sustainable measures. They look at everything that creates CO2, and of course the building industry has a massive, contributes to that. So we understand that this emergency is not just for architects, it's for everybody, but we have a particular role and responsibility to act. And Peter Buchanan recently wrote The Big Rethink, Place and Aliveness, Pattern, Play and the Planet, and he will be talking about that, about our relationship between nature and mankind, and why certainly in the 20th century we felt that we could master it and use it as an endless resource. Clearly that's not going to be possible in the near future. What do we do? And more generally, this module allows you to research and unpack the history of and current debate around future practice, to critically examine practice in relation to theory, culture and design, to map out a position of what you believe in, and you'll write a 3,000 to 4,000 word illustrated document, which becomes a map, if you like, for your final year. In other words, it's you saying and thinking about what is your purpose as an architect? What do you believe in? And that's why you'll write a manifesto, a climate emergency manifesto. Here's some from previous years: Architecture Against Neoliberalism, Beyond Building, Atlas Paddling, a manifesto to become a gardener of the earth. And I just want to more or less end with this feedback from a student who said, the manifesto was crucial to me. The first time I could spend some time to sort out many of my thoughts about architecture and try to position myself as an architect and really asking myself, why am I doing what I do? I think that's quite a unique offer, and certainly something that we encourage you as an individual to work through and to come up with this bold proposal. So, ending in Corbusier, Architectural Revolution, probably going to be both. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions, hearing from you, seeing you, maybe even in person in September. Thank you very much.
So what's design direction all about? Well, it's all about you, really. This is a wonderful opportunity in your academic career before you move on to your professional career to really think about the issues in architecture and society that really stimulate you. And our job as tutors is to help you deepen and broaden your thinking about the things which you are passionate about. I'd like to remind you of the LSA prime values, which you were introduced to right at the very beginning of this of your time here at the LSA. We're looking for people who want to create architecture that's propositional, that's relevant to live issues, that's innovative, that's metropolitan, and that's entrepreneurial. All of these prime values you need to be thinking about for this design direction course. You were also asked 3 questions right at the very beginning of your time here at the LSA. What change do you want to see in the world? How does your architecture contribute to that change? And who do you want to be as a designer? And this design direction course particularly is an opportunity for you to really think deeply and broadly about these 3 huge questions that you've been considering. And finally, just to remind you that we see design direction as not really the end of the first year. It's really the beginning of your second year. It's really getting you prepared for that wonderful adventure you're going to be taking part in next year, where you spend a whole year thinking about architecture, design, around the set of issues that you are interested in. And design direction helps you to navigate towards that, helps you to deepen your brief about the things you are passionate about in architecture. I want to share just some little sketch diagrams really that as to why this pre-design stage of creative thinking is so important. And there are several diagrams which look quite superficially the same, but they all answer slightly different questions. This one is about innovation. If you compare the sorts of questions we ask ourselves, running up the left-hand side of the diagram towards the answers, you can really get 4 quadrants, really. We can either get old answers to old questions. That's a waste of time. We're not interested in that. You might want to think about creating new answers to old questions, number 3 on the diagram there. Equally, there seems no point in going to square number 2, getting old answers to new questions. What we're really after is you finding new answers to new questions. And design direction is about you finding those new questions, such that during your design course you can get to new answers. A similar quadrant, a piece of comparing two issues of complexity and order. This is a diagram which we developed in thinking about the city. Really, the number one is really something which a place of low complexity and perhaps low order, something informal like a village. You think there's a lot of architects, a lot of planners, particularly modernist planners, who have tended to revert towards square number two, kind of utopian thinking, which imposes very great order at the expense of really considering anything to do with the genuine complexity which needs to be examined. Number three on this thing, a place of very high complexity and very low order, some kind of dystopia, the sort of things we see in slum dwellings which are occurring across the world, and the great city, which is of course the thing that Jane Jacobs directed us towards, to think about ordered complexity as the goal of urbanism and thinking. And I always like to include this quote from the famous 19th century art critic Jacob Burckhardt, where he said that the essence of tyranny is the denial of complexity. In other words, that highly ordered thinking on the last slide, which denies complexity. It's a big problem in architecture and urbanism, and in politics, I think, this tyranny of the denial of complexity. And why does briefing matter? Why does this design direction course matter in terms of you developing a brief? The same sort of diagram. What you really want to get to is to ask yourself a great question. Number two, the top left-hand thing. Do the creative thinking to get to have a great question, because all you then need to do is apply your design talent to move it into square one there, where you have a great answer to a great question. If you start off with a poor question in square number 4, a poor question, you apply design talent. What you can end up with is a great answer to the wrong question. And we see that all the time, don't we, in the environment. Great, elegant answers which don't actually answer the need. So here we're in the design direction course. We're trying to get you into square number 2, such that when you start in the next year, you're able just to apply your design talent to moving your proposition towards a great answer to a great question. And finally, the research process. The relationship between information that you might gather and the conviction you might have about that information. If you just gather more and more information, you end up in confusion at the top there. If you don't bother to gather information but just increase your conviction, you end up in a state of delusion. What we want you to do is apply your convictions and information gathering in order to arrive in the top right-hand corner again in a state of a revelation, that you reveal new truths, new ideas to inform your design. This is the program we're going to be working through. It's quite long, but it's divided into a series of assignments, as you can see indicated by the orange dots as we climb down this staircase. We're not going to tell you what all the assignments are. We're going to announce those sequentially as we go through. And you'll be and at the end, what you're going to be doing is producing a portfolio summarizing your brief. And in your documentation, you'll have seen that this includes these 7 sections. What's your higher goal? What's the objective? What's the strategy of your project? Why? Why is this project needed? What are the precedents? Who's it for? Who are the users? Who are the citizens who will benefit from this? Number 4, about you. What is your manifesto? What is your community of practice? What sort of architect are you going to be? Where will it be? In the city, in the borough? What's the specific site? What are the diagrams that sum up your thinking? And finally, going back to that very early question you were asked, what will the impact be? Some building recommendations. If you want to read quite deeply. A very straightforward book by Van Meel, Briefing for Buildings. Terrifically straightforward explanation. It's very practice-based. You'll find that this will apply to yourself in practice probably better than in academia, but nonetheless it has some terrific, simple, straightforward, clear writing about the issue of briefing. There's lots of books which what you should read should depend, I guess, on the particular topic that you're interested in, but these two I think are pertinent. Richard Florida's recent book, The New Urban Crisis, is I think people at the LSA are quite concerned with. Not a great book, a little bit numbers heavy, but insightful nonetheless. And Steven Pinker in Enlightenment Now, a really great read, talking about a cri de coeur for people to embrace Enlightenment thinking. So we move to assignment 1. What is it you're going to do for the first week? It only lasts a week. It's a very short, a very short assignment to loosen you up. We want you to select a great work of London architecture that you love. We want you to prepare a summary presentation of the building in 20 slides. And the 20 slides, you'll have 20 seconds to present each slide at the end of this week. We want you to tell us why you love it, how the architecture creates the emotional response that you're feeling. What's the site and the setting? What are the organizational principles? What's the construction and finishes? Is it the details that you're really interested in? And prepare a 100-word description. This will last for 1 week, and the submission will be next week, in a week's time, when we will review it. We had intended to do a pecha of this, a live pecha with everybody in the same room. In the end, we did this online. It was extraordinary. The one book you should read to inform this this task is this one, Ed Jones and Christopher Woodward's fantastic book called A Guide to the Architecture of London. Wonderfully scholarly, detailed piece of work, which really consumed these two for very long periods of them walking around London, thinking about the architecture they could see. So I would recommend that you get that. If you don't have it, definitely put it on your Christmas shopping list. Thank you very much.
Everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm one of the DTT leaders. Our topic this year is symbiotic cities. And I have to say, albeit, a bit of a strange year that we're having this year, our DTTs, I think, are doing really well. And it's quite exciting to see, actually, I have to say. So you've had an overview, of first year and both years so far. But just to recap in terms of how you get into the DTT, you start in first year with design cities, and then you obviously explore London, and then that links into effectively the design think tank, which follows on. And what that does is it kind of gives you a kickstart effectively to your design think tank and what research kind of questions you want to start exploring, what topics you want to start challenging. And it also helps to locate those research ideas that you can bring forward, some things you might identify in design cities, and then it may be relevant later on for the design think tank. So it's, we orchestrate it this way, so you have a dovetail of a program effectively to try and help tease out more ideas. So the main thing, I guess, with the DTT, which is also different from other courses, is the fact that it is group work, largely group work. And whilst a lot of people always try to shy away from this and and think it's quite a difficult thing, the reality of it is this is actually a lot more realistic in terms of how we work in practice. Obviously most of you, if you continue on throughout architecture, you're going to be working in practices often with very large teams. Not one person does it all. So it's one of the really valuable learning lessons that you get as part of the design think tank, how to work in a group, how to work as a team. And it also kind of challenges you to accept and embrace your strengths and weaknesses, both as a person and as a designer and an architect, and really encourages you then to work well together with your team and to benefit from the other strengths and weaknesses that other people have. So as I mentioned, and everyone else has so far, the other different fact about the LSA is that you are taught by the practice network. And as Clive mentioned, we're all practicing architects. And that also means that any topics and research ideas that come out of the design think tanks are really founded, in reality and with pragmatic terms. But this doesn't mean that, you're not thinking outside the box, far from it. As Clive mentioned, we're trying to challenge the norms a lot of the time. We're interested in social change and social constructs and always asking questions. But the difference is having the input from the professional practice allows us to arrange talks and give you guidance from industry professionals, such as talks from the GLA, or potential funders, or things about policy changes and other new practices that may have done that one type of project that they managed to push it through, which isn't normal. So we try and give you the guidance of how you can actually impact change where possible. And I think that's the main difference from when I studied in architecture. There wasn't that real life aspect to it in the slightest. So I think that's the most exciting thing effectively about the LSA is you have that real connection to making an impact and the industry as well. And then, as Clive and Steve also mentioned it before, and fundamentally, it really is about you guys. Our role in the DTT as leaders and as tutors is to empower you guys to ask those questions, to find the questions as well, so we will ask you a lot of questions at the same time. You may come to us with different ideas and suggestions, and it may seem like at times, that we're a bit annoying because we keep asking, but what is your question? What is the question? It's what Steve mentioned. We're trying to find that really good question. So then we can assist you in your critical thinking and design testing through your research to find that really good answer to that really good question as well. And I think that's what the design think tank is about, is creating that forum where you can all work together, utilize everyone else's knowledge and strengths and weaknesses, and start teasing out all of these really important questions that sometimes never get challenged in other schools, and things often just end up being a run-of-the-mill design project, and you have the potential here at the LSA to do something much more exciting and much more dynamic. So I think that's the most that I want to say about that. But it's definitely, it's all about you guys, and that's what we're here to assist you in how you want to progress and what questions you want to explore and how you want to learn. So we're here for you, effectively.
Hi. So everyone's been describing their kind of specialisms and their skills and their modules, but I think let's just go backwards for 1 second. You're sitting there thinking, how do I choose a school? And that's the key question for this evening, is you've got very few choices, and the choices are going to be whether you go to the Bartlett, the AA, whether you go to Westminster, because those are the schools in London that generally, and maybe the Royal College of Art, that generally kind of sets the precedent for what is deemed to be an education for a postgraduate student in part 2. Now, not doing the hard sell, but just giving you the kind of facts that I think you need to kind of consider. What we try to do is teach you how to be an architect and how to be yourself and to be the best version of yourself. And if you understand what you've been presented with to date, it's essentially a kind of a linear diagram where what we do in the first year is we prepare you from looking at the city to looking at issues, which are the design think tanks, to then formulating a brief in the final part of your first year to begin to anticipate the architect that you want to become and the architecture that you want to make. which means essentially two things, is how you think and what you do. So the way you think is about how you critically engage with this discourse in a rigorous fashion, which essentially means that from people like Peter, people like Alan, people like James, they teach you that kind of relationship between your practice, which is based on the history of architecture, the present condition, and how you're going to affect the future. So as a designer, we're trying to kind of essentially establish two things. One is to be able to teach you how to make a critical position clear to not just the discipline, but to something which is relevant outside the discipline that affects how we kind of behave as human beings. So if we're going to teach you to be the best version of yourself, we have to critically engage with you to teach you how to think. And that's what the first year is designed to do, is how do we kind of create a kind of forum for discussion, but also how do we create a way of working together that understands that as a practitioner, you have to kind of come up with not just something unique, but how do you innovate as an architect, which is to work with the current condition that we're looking at, which is the discipline of architecture, which has broad conditions, tentacles, which affect everything from politics, policy, of course, culture, economics, environmental issues, and so on. So in the design think tanks, we begin to kind of politicize you with a big and small p, so that you understand the kind of the condition of governance and how you can affect this towards something that would become a way of you understanding strategically how to kind of be not just informed, but how to change the way that we can relate to the sort of world that we design. And in second year, what you do is you basically begin to kind of engage as a designer, which essentially is when you become the architect that you'll become forever. So by the time you leave the LSA, not only have you worked for the first year within a practice that gives you this kind of skill, but also you leave the LSA with the skills that you need to begin to be the architect that you'll become for the rest of your life. So our education is not about fantasy and it's not about fiction. It's about applying the knowledge that you need as an architect to the discipline of architecture to the best of your ability. And the thing about education is it never stops. I mean, I'm older than him. The fact is we never stop learning. And the privilege of the LSA, which I think is something that is kind of understood, but maybe kind of not made absolute, is we are engaged in practice. So the convergence of practice with academia is something that is a unique position within the LSA. So our USP, besides making sure that when you get a job, it's a right job for you, that you go into that job as an expert and somebody can change that landscape, but that the actual relationship in terms of the dialogue between who we are and how we think is immersed into the practice of architecture. So the people that you're going to meet who are going to teach you, that's the privilege, are all practicing architects. So everyone who's teaching architecture in the LSA is embedded in practice, from the biggest practices to the smallest. And what that does is it gives us this kind of range of kind of old heads and new people doing kind of exciting new things. But the idea is that all of this as a kind of landscape of opportunity is made present to you from the day you enter into the LSA. Again, the distinction between us and other schools of design and architecture is that we don't tell you how to think in the way that we would think, or how to draw in the way that we would draw if we were you. And that unit system that is prevalent throughout education in the UK essentially suffocates you, it stifles you from becoming who you want to become and the best version of yourself. So what we'll do in the next 2 years is we will equip you to be yourself, to be the best version of yourself, and to be educated by the best people that we believe are available towards kind of educating you as architects. So again, in summary, in the first year, we equip you critically, and you kind of learn how to think. And the second year, you design the architecture that you want to be kind of recognized as. Thank you.
I'm here to tell you about the History of Design module that comes in year 2, which I have taught now for all the years of the LSA. This began in a conversation about what was apparently missing from both the history of architecture and from how it was taught. I'm a historian, not a trained designer, but I was interested in the subject of architectural education because it seemed like a key to understanding a great deal else. How people teach things must have a bearing on how they do them. So it goes through a series of topics in weekly lectures. That's how it begins, and then moves into a student project at the end. What I'm going to do now is show you what these weekly topics are, and through that I hope you'll understand what it's aiming to do. So the title History of Design is not terribly useful or accurate, I have to admit, but we've tried other things and this seems to be the best one. But these questions on the first slide should help you to focus on what this is about. Quite basic questions, but focusing back in on what it is that an architect does with a design. A lot of the study of architectural history has tended to move away from that, look at almost anything else but that. I think it's inherently interesting and actually very important if we're going to get better buildings. And this doesn't presuppose anything in particular about what the design will be, what ideas it'll be based on. So we can study it historically, we can learn from that history, we can also learn from individual projects on which there is evidence to reconstruct what the design process was. I've used this quote from OMA, which is probably tongue-in-cheek, as many of their things are, but the idea that the half-life of architecture's collective memory is now around 6 months strikes a chord with me. There's a lot that people used to know that they sort of don't know anymore, and I think this is reflected in teaching and also reflected in what we see in buildings. They're just rather starved of content. This represents the first lecture, which is really about plans, and as you can see from the left-hand example, a lot of it is about France. It was in France that ideas about planning were organized, written about, new words came into being to describe what was done, and an educational system was built on these that had very particular standards, procedures, and so on. This plan on the left was often held up as an example of great architectural skill, and the red lines represent the center axis in various different parts of the plan, which you can see is not one continuous line, but the skill was to almost confuse you into thinking that it almost could be, that wherever you stood there was something you could see was a center point, and that would control your, to some extent, your movement through the building. So plan is not an abstract thing. It's not necessarily a calculation about economy of space or anything else. It is an art form that has a purpose to make you feel comfortable or make you feel other things within a building. Stirling and Wilford, represented here, were particularly skilled at devising complex plans that are simply delightful because they're clever and full of unexpected twists and turns, but they do, in many people's view anyway, produce buildings that are fun to be in. Tectonics is a completely different area, and it represents another thread in architectural history, again very strong in France, as it happens, picking out the question of how do buildings stand up physically and how you can make that into a form of design. The picture on the left is an example taking this notion of iron splay diagonal columns from the French theorist Viollet-le-Duc, and then putting it, perhaps a unique case, putting it into a building. But there's a great deal more that one can unwrap from this question of tectonics. It's something that many architects are striving for. It's become a bit of a buzzword, not so easy to achieve in current building practices and economies. But Short and Ford, represented here, have responded in a number of buildings, now just Alan Short, in fact, to the idea of what you can do tectonically, even in rather restricted conditions. This is to contrast with a lot of architecture that is not tectonic in any obvious way, where you have a steel structure supporting something that is sort of wrapped over the outside and doesn't give you any idea how the thing is held up on the inside. This is the architecture of what you see is what you get. Whether that's worth it for its own sake is something to think about. Design as language. This idea of design being a language has been around on and off for a long time, but it was one of the things that modernism almost tried to suppress, at least as part of its discussion, that the building should be a transparent sort of screen through which its identity could be viewed. The architect didn't have a responsibility or indeed any excuse for trying to dress it up or make it extravagant. Robert Venturi in the lower photograph is a famous example of an architect who said, I'm bored with this. I want my buildings to be able to say things. And he went off and did that and influenced a lot of other people. The upper picture comes from a time when architecture as language was fully accepted. There was no question about it, but it operated within conventions of classicism, which could be adopted or they could be broken. And this was a rich period called Mannerism. This city gate could have been a very plain structure. Nothing more was required, but here it is making a lot of statements about the ancient world, about ideas about gender, military strength, and so on, through a language that everybody understood. Design and decorum. Decorum is a word that's only just coming back. It was for a long time thought to be stuffy and not modern, but it's quite clear that the public care about these things. The public takes a view of buildings, and what it's based on is some rather inarticulate idea, usually, of what's right. So this lecture unpacks this concept a bit further. I'm giving you here a famous example of where ideas about decorum became a big public debate, and quoting here the Prince of Wales, who objected to the design on the left for reasons of decorum, which are hard to articulate, but this is how he did it, and it's become rather a famous quote. And then the quote on the right, I was very pleased to find that in the archive of the National Gallery, where he was on TV and quite clearly didn't really like what had come in its place, but couldn't quite say so. And again, there are arguments about that, but it's a broad subject and one where an architect can play off expectations. It's not a sort of dull conformity to expectation. It is something to accept, to bear in mind, and then turn to creative use, in my view. This one called Learning to Fly, I always feel I'm on shaky ground here. I'm talking about things that I'm the person looking through the keyhole. And Rainer Bannon, historian and critic, felt the same way in this text that's quoted here, that something was going on that he couldn't see, couldn't understand, and didn't think he was being included in. This is a key question, nonetheless, about what is it that gives you liftoff as a designer. And at the LSA, there's a concern to help to make that happen in ways that are socially responsible, that are communicative in a broader field, and not just playing to the in crowd, as it were. So this should come to the nub of the whole value. What is it that makes a building good as a design? It's quite possibly something that a lot of people don't notice, but we believe that there is something there. And this lecture is really the introduction to the project, because we ask the students to think about what they've learnt and find a case study subject through which they can apply it. And certain architects, certain buildings, certain periods have a particular richness in this respect that you can do them very often graphically, as you can see here. It's the images that make the argument, and partly for that reason, this project that the students do for the course is a portfolio project printed out on A3 sheets in which the graphic explanation is as important as the verbal one. It's not just an essay, it's a design project in itself. What you can see here in the top left are the sort of parallel studies that became something that architects did in the 18th century and onwards, where you draw similar examples to the same scale, maybe simplify them into figure ground plans, as you can see with the London Underground stations done by one of our, not one of our students, but it's a good drawing, I think. Down below, the architect Peter Inskip has studied the English architect Edwin Lutyens and managed to extrapolate these generic plan diagrams. So moving from the actual example to the diagram is part of the analytical process, factoring in things about how buildings were used, in this case a smallish country house involving servants, and relating it to the path of the sun. So the site offers different possibilities in relation to that, and the plan adjusts accordingly. Down bottom right, Colin Rowe, famous example of putting side by side a villa by Palladio, which is the top two images, and a villa by Le Corbusier, and perhaps by sleight of hand, saying these are really the same thing, aren't they? But it is very stimulating to have done that, whether it's really true or not. It's a brilliant mental exercise. So I'm finishing with 3 examples of work that students have done. We do a lot of tutoring for this project, and through that it becomes something that we hope is enjoyable and also educational, learning how to undertake this process, which is something that can then be applied back on anybody's own work or the work of people they're collaborating with. Here you can see it represented graphically. Of course, there is more verbal content that comes in as well. And some very good research gets done. Simple things here coming down the left, using the idea of analyzing a plan with axes and circulation routes, comparing the footprint of different buildings, 2 Cambridge colleges, a historic one and a modernist one, and then going into the detail of the actual plans of the rooms. So it's a chance to document a building, get to know it well, and we try and find things that people can actually visit. This is housing in Italy, which raises wider questions seen in the image here about the politics of housing, which is always a concern. So that represents a rather different aspect of the work, but the analytical side was there too. And this is the final one, a project that rather unexpectedly won the Stirling Prize. Architects intervening in an older building, something that has become increasingly part of most practices' work, and which has implications for resources and ecology that are very important. In this case, Witherford Watson Mann broke through many conventions about how this can be done in a project for a building that had had a disastrous fire, had been abandoned, and was then converted for the Landmark Trust into a temporary holiday residence, and they were able to do some rather fantastic things with it. So that is the conclusion of this presentation. And the whole of this exercise flashes through quite fast in the autumn term of the second year. But this is what we do in respect of history, and there are also visits we organise and a more general discussion of history that runs through. When I say history, I mean all the things you can learn and think about buildings of whatever time, including the present, that runs through the course as a whole.
Good evening, prospective LSA students. My name's Kinneir, and I'm here to talk you through the Tectonic module. In most institutions, that's called the technical module. Here at the LSA, it's focused more on the tactics to build, the methods with which we equip you to leave the school, join the profession in whatever manner you may choose to join it, and go on and build buildings, grow the city, and change the future of how we live. So I've got about 20 slides, and I'm going to talk you through some of those. Some of them are past students, but ultimately it is about how one communicates those design ideas, those details and design principles into many methods of communication with all of the agencies in the built environment that are required to fulfill your big ideas. So, tactics to build. Leading change through multiple skills, scales, and stakeholders. What are your tactics to build? How do we build on those tactics? What are your hard skills? And how erudite are you? Are you an orator? Or do you rely on other methods in order to get across your design ideas? And how do you build on sensibilities that can make sure that you have imbued senses of intuition on the opportunities of a site and the opportunities of a program and the opportunities of clients and all of those stakeholders that are required to resolve your ideas. So this is a project by one of our first year's students, the first cohort's students. It looked at a site on Oxford Street, and at the very start of the technical tectonic module, we bring in all the broad constraints of the city, so all of the parts that are beginning to affect the buildability, the site infrastructure, the logistics of how the city works. And we start to refine that into the way in which you are the prospector, a navigator, an adventurer, diplomat or envoy, a leader which engenders a trust that equips people to stand in front. So how do you stand in front of your team, that being both your team in a studio and your team on a project, to make sure that they understand your big ideas and they can then realize through their own skill sets what you're trying to achieve. You are not alone in this, and you must understand how you can rely on other people to aid you. So how do we break that down? How do we understand the many components of a building and the many components and requirements of a site to host that building? So how does that building sit within its context? What are the structural systems, the servicing systems, but how do they fit into a tectonic language, a building language and an aesthetic which is at one with all the other parts, all the other players. One that can be cohesively understood together and also built. Importantly, it is one to be resolved. So can I afford to, and will I understand the questions I'm asking and therefore the answers I am given in order to make the decisions asked of me and provide the necessary instructions in a timely manner? What is it for you to be an architect? How can you distill all of these many complicated components into a set of clear instructions that other people carry out on your behalf? There are still duties for you to carry out, but ultimately you are the design team leader and often the contract administrator. So how does that responsibility sit on your shoulders in order to realize these architectural ideas that you are beginning to create? This is a master plan by one of the students last year. It looked at Thameside East, just near City Airport, you can see, and it's the old sugar refinery. And it set out some big objectives for the reuse, the cut and carve of existing buildings into a new master plan. It's a very, very big project. In comparison to some detailed building projects, this was an infrastructural project in the terms of services of the city, but also how a large swathe, many acres of the city, could be repurposed. And that's important to understand, that the breadth of this module's learning and teaching fulfills and can accommodate the many interests of the school's cohort. The school doesn't set out to set an agenda for all students to fall under one Jenny mould. Each student is pursuing their own interest, and therefore, as the final module of the school, sitting alongside your final design project, this must accommodate and facilitate your ideas. So that has to build upon all of those structures which you're trying to build in order to set out the argument for your project. This module starts to allow you to understand things like procurement. How are the many stakeholders working together? How do you set out an argument that will allow you to place the best emphasis of your project to a point where it could be realised? How could you take your project as a graduate to that building owner, that landowner, that local authority, and say, I've been working on this for a year. You need to sit down and listen to me, because maybe we can work together. Project of your own professional career. So procurement must be understood by you, and it's an important part of this module. This sets out a structure. Each student is asked to set out and understand their structure, and then reorganize it, reverse engineer how that organogram of many stakeholders needs to be set to your best advantage. So how are those routes understood? How is your process encouraged? What are the dead ends, and how do we return back and iterate? This is a project by a student 2 years ago, and it was reviewing academic institutions and then opportunities for deprived neighbourhoods to find better ways of multi-generational support and education, youth education. It was a political project as much as it was an architectural project, and it needed to understand many social circles and many more liminal boundaries other than sort of political or geographic boundaries. It needed to zoom into the infrastructural consequences of post-industrial heritage, but then also bring in the sensibilities of what a nursery or a creche is for a child. Those vast complexities of political bandwagoning, geographic boundaries, contaminated land, big industrial heritage, but then also what does a child just need for themselves to be at one and to learn at 2 years old. So how do we bring in to merge all those parts? How do we understand the constraints on you as an architect and on the project? What are the realities? There are fiscal realities, there are political terms and realities, and there's the project delivery. Once that project starts, what momentum can be maintained to assure that it is delivered? And then how do we break that down? How do we understand those chartered principles, the ROBA stages from 0 to 7, and all of then those stakeholders that we began to talk about that are languaged into non-commissioned parts, bits that you have less control over, so the planning authorities, building control, councillors, journalists, and then there's commissioned parts that you fall within as a project and design team. Your ability to understand and create a map across those will allow you to be able to interact and work with them to fulfill those objectives. This is a project in Soho Square, again by one of the first cohort students, and it looked to repurpose a series of large, less efficient commercial buildings, and to try and understand how the square could act as a major part of what was lacking in those buildings in terms of shared space, and understand that that was still a seasonal consequence or constraint, but that those buildings could start to work together and create more of an epicenter. It was an urban question as the necessity of squares around buildings that host large amounts of workforce. And as a technical module beyond that thesis, it began to unpick how the city, a very complex position with Crossrail, with Northern Line and with the Central Line, could or could not facilitate that, but how importantly there was a requirement to certainly upgrade this quarter. So what is the importance of the designs being critical, the client being discerning, to question the brief and to engage challenges and suspend your disbelief? How can you persuade somebody to suspend their disbelief in order to follow for a moment your belief? And maybe during that process of that suspension, you're able to bring them round, or equally find a middle ground. And what is the common ground between you both? So Observation is as constraint, and constraint as opportunity. How can you begin to turn constraints into opportunities for the brief to be developed? So what are those site logistics? How can you understand what can and can't be built on the site? A really important part to that is, do you have to decant all of those people living and working in the building, or can you work simultaneously? So there are many now complexities which we're adding into the module that form a more technical direction, but ultimately are becoming imbued and intuitive responses that you can have. You can look at a site and you can begin to say, I can see what the opportunities are there for architecture. So critic as comment and critic as alternative. So how can you be that continual critic in the city, that person who is able to see opportunity and beyond just it being a nuanced comment, be an alternative that you can express and that you can mobilize? Is it a subjective opinion, or do you have an objective fact that you can pursue? Both are important, but ultimately you need to make sure that as an architect and at the point at which you're building, there are facts. There are still tolerances and allowances, and you must be strong enough and clear enough, erudite with your information to be able to deliver it in such purpose. But there will be dead ends. How is your pursuit in that project and that project program allowing you to iterate and test ideas, find those common grounds, be discerning and humble enough to realize that you've come to a dead end and you need to return back to the main thread and pursue a new route of iteration. And this is a project, this is the sugar refinery project you saw earlier, the master plan of. How does that break down now into those technical definitions? How do we begin to understand what was the important part of that project as a master plan? It was the space between those existing buildings. It was a landscape that began to understand the original materials of that piece of city and which parts were cultural heritage and important to retain, and balance between a historicist approach. And that was through a technical understanding to break down those parts and then start to be able to deliver them from a material point of view and a construction point of view. Reach a point of sincerity, confess the terms of interest. How will the proposal be judged? Test, and iterate. And that student began to work with cast iron and understand these slabs that could be repurposed from some of the infrastructure of that building into the landscape of the new master plan, webbing in a technical understanding of the capabilities and lifespan of cast iron, but then also into the cultural heritage of that part of the city and the architecture that they were pursuing. Many complex melting pots of both interests and criteria that, importantly, one needs to be able to see holistically that larger map, that larger diagram of all of the components sitting together in order to bring them together, wash them through and deliver that piece of architecture. So there will be dead ends, there will be return routes, there will be ways through, but one needs to be able to stand back, remain holistic, and have clear continuity in your approach. So what is your letter to the contractor, the constructor? How are you, like this example from Solowit in 1976, explain what you're wanting to achieve, and for it to be an explanation that can remain and be pursued long after your involvement in the project. So in simple terms, can you on a single piece of A4 define what you're doing, set it out in those points of communication and move forward? Critic is design, clarity is client. Can you be the client? Thank you.
Everyone. So hi, yeah, I'm a second year design tutor, and second year is really about your own personal inquiry. And I think that's the critical difference between the LSA side final year and other colleges, which is you define your brief. We ask you and we work with you to set a personal line of inquiry, something that is very personal and particular from the work that you do in your previous year. And then we work to develop that with you to really ask kind of complicated and really poignant questions about environment and politics and society and urbanism and city and placemaking, and how your project is tackling these issues in a really innovative and challenging way. And what we want to do as design tutors is not to lead that program of study, but to work with you collaboratively to inform the output of it. So our role is very much to challenge you, provoke you, debate with you, work with you, We will, of course, inform you. We will, of course, kind of provide and support you with evidence and examples. We'll also connect you to the wider network. A key role that all of the tutors play in the second year is that we are all working in practice. We all have great connections, and we connect you to experts in other fields, and we bring them in, and we allow that to kind of expertise to kind of flow through your project and to kind of really bring a sense of rigor to your work. We're also there to help you learn how to communicate those ideas, and it's critical. It's a critical part of architecture, but how you communicate those ideas both verbally and orally, but also through the drawing material and the written words. So a big part of what we do is work with you to take skills, natural skills that you already have and accent you in them, but also teach you new skills and learn, and to kind of really show you different mediums, be that kind of film, drawing, very kind of interesting work coming out of this year because of the need for everything to be more digital. So it's really interesting to see how that's kind of challenging us and the students. And then finally, layered under all of that is this sort of rooted question about what kind of architect and what kind of work do you want to produce in the future? What's the legacy that you're looking to move towards? And your thesis becomes a really important stepping stone in that. So our role is to really challenge you and question you all the time about that, and about what is different, what is unique, what is innovative, what is bold about what you're proposing, and do you stand by it? Are you prepared to kind of put your hand on your heart and say, this is the best that I can do, and this is what society deserves? So that's what our role is. There are currently 8 tutors. We work in pairs, so you don't just have one person's opinion, you're constantly moving, having 2 tutors, so that you get that kind of diversity and pluralism of different views. We're from big practices and small practices, so you get real exposure to different viewpoints. And I think, as Clive was saying kind of earlier, a kind of quite unique level of expertise across all of the tutors that we're kind of bringing to the opportunity. So yeah, look forward to answering any questions that you have, and seeing hopefully all of you in a year or two's time.
So hi everybody, and welcome. I'm Conor, one of the second year student reps, and Cora and I are going to talk about our kind of experience over the last year and a half of the LSA. And during our first year, the 2 of us worked together on a design think tank. It was called Generational Shift, and it kind of investigated how young voices could inform a new approach to designing community centers. And we've become kind of good friends ever since. So over to you to kick things off, Cora.
Great, thanks, Conor. So one of the great things about the LSA is its culture of collaboration. And as a think tank, we work together with both each other and the practice network to resolve some really complex design issues. But as Conor mentioned, it also allowed us to make some great friendships along the way. This culture of collaboration really extends beyond just the boundaries of the LSA. There are so many opportunities to work with organisations outside of the university. Our group works specifically with Hackney Council and the Hackney Young Futures Commission to undertake some community engagement, which gave our project a real grounding in reality. As Hannah mentioned, though, that as you progress into second year, the course differs from many other universities in the sense that it does not offer the kind of classic unit modules, and that gives you such a great opportunity to explore your own interests and design styles.
Great, so a really exciting aspect of particularly the first year is how the lessons learned in practice can begin to inform your academic work. So I did my practice placement at Fifth Studio, and whilst I was there, worked on a range of projects spanning the disciplines of urban design, architecture, and landscape. And the projects that I worked on kind of in practice really situated the problems that I wanted to address academically in the real world. And this dialogue was incredibly rewarding. I also had a mentor in practice last year who was very helpful and engaged with the type of work that we're doing at the LSA. So the network was an incredible resource to us. And in a pre-COVID world, we were able to see a lot of London whilst working. So this is a picture of me kind of head down at the National Theatre during an afternoon of drawing and discussing in our design think tanks. And particularly for those of us who kind of weren't from London like I was, this was a great way to kind of begin to read the city and enjoy it. So to wrap up from us, this is a kind of exciting opportunity to meet like-minded people, to network, and to make good friends. So I hope you enjoy the rest of this evening, and we're looking forward to hopefully meeting you and seeing what kind of exciting things you get up to over the next couple of years. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Hi everyone. So my name is Priya. I just recently graduated last year. My time at the LSA was fantastic and enriched with so much knowledge, information, and research. It really challenges you to think about what kind of architect you want to be coming out of graduating, what kind of impact you want to make, whether this be a social impact, a cultural one, sustainable or environmental one, and what skills you'd need to do these. So my particular project was based on something that I wanted to make a social impact with. And with the LSA, they really challenged me in thinking outside the box and also finding new ways I could challenge this. So mine was on gender equality and picking issues surrounding female empowerment. And so how this could make an impact to society, and coming out of the LSA, what I can take forward. So that was, keeping the user at the forefront constantly, and also designing in a way where I'm thinking about empathy and well-being. So it really does challenge you in how you're going to make that impact. I just wanted to answer one of the questions that I saw from someone called Calvin about how does being in practice help while being at the LSA when you're going to be in practice for life. For me personally, this was one of the strongest attributes to going to the LSA, my personal experience. Not only you're appointed a mentor, which helps hugely with topics that are coming up in your thesis, and also it helped bringing in real life projects that I was working on and my own input in with real clients and architects that I was working with, and also gaining information from those architects that I was surrounded with during my own work. So I felt it being so beneficial, the resources, the knowledge, and the opportunities that you gain from being in such a great practice network are amazing while after graduating, because there's so many networking opportunities and also contacts that you make along the way. And I think that is something that honestly is such a strong factor about this school, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll pass on to Fraser now, briefly.
Yes, I'm going to be brief. I'm one of the graduates from where is it now, the third year of students. And I mean, it's quite difficult to kind of end on everything that's kind of been discussed already. And almost now, I suppose in hindsight, I have a little bit of perspective having been out of it for a couple of years. And I think the interesting thing is that, Will's throwing you some facts about employment after and all these sort of things. And Clive's telling you about us figuring out what we want to be. And it's very easy to kind of say, oh, yeah, well, yes, well, everyone can say that. But I think, even from conversations with a lot of peers after we graduated, we are where we want to be and we are doing what we want to be doing. And I think that's actually a lot rarer than we kind of appreciate, especially coming out of academia in a certain way. And I think the interesting thing for me was that I realized that architecture isn't just a singular thing in just building buildings, but it's the systems that enable those things to be in the first place, and so on. And so everything that I kind of discovered for myself has allowed me to operate across a variety of scales now, in doing what I'm doing and where I'm doing it. So I think, at the end of the day, the school for me delivered on its promises. And I think that's the same across the board for a lot of us. So yeah.